This is why the corporates in America have all hopped into the sovereign US state and are seeing it as a vehicle for exercising leverage and power against everyone else to achieve their market goal, which is to increase their margins. Basically, it's as raw as that. Call that American, entitlement.
And this is why you're talking about an oligarchic rentier.
That's
economy.
why it's very important to understand that that America is an oligarchic society, not a democratic society now.
And it's a rent-seeking capitalism.
Oligarchy.
It's a rent-seeking capitalism, not a competitive capitalism. Welcome to another edition of Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality, and I have a particularly not an uncomfortable guest, but a guest who's had some uncomfortable collisions with reality lately, as we all have, and he's helped me understand just how uncomfortable things are and contribute ever so slightly to trying to get some focus on the extraordinary things that are going on in the world. So I'd like to introduce Greg Smith. I've known Greg Smith for a very long time, since I first worked for John Button in 1981. He is possibly the person in Australia who knows more about the tax system than anyone. And certainly I don't recommend that you get into an argument with Greg about the tax system. Certainly not the tax system between the 1980s and the 2010s or a bit beyond, but perhaps today as well. But the reason I'm introducing you to Greg, I'm pretty excited to do so, is that a friend of mine invited me to a private meeting, a private session. And the reason he called the session is that he'd been so struck with Greg's insights into the situation that Australia finds itself in. That was already true before Donald Trump arrived in the White House, but he did a second session a week and a half or so ago. Things have even moved since then. And he certainly helped me to understand the gravity of the situation. So welcome, Greg. Please correct anything I've said that you want to disown, anything I've said that's wrong, and start taking us into your thinking about what the hell is going on.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Nick. I have nothing to correct. It is true that it goes back a long time. I was in public policy for 50 years, and I'm not in public policy now, but at least not in a professional way. But I am still commenting when asked on it, which is why we're here now. So what I did last year that led to a range of discussions was an essay on why Australia can't get things done, which was essentially my story about how Australia is coping with the 21st century, or not coping. And what we did very recently was like a case study of that, which is, well, how's Australia coping? How's it understanding its situation in the aftermath of the inauguration of President Trump for the second time? So I think that's what's provoked our conversation here. And I guess my hypothesis is that Australia is ill prepared for all of the issues coming at us in the 21st century because it underinvests in those issues, particularly underinvests in the capacity of the state to respond to them. And now we have this case study of having to confront a kind of sudden acceleration of those 21st century pressures or challenges on us, an acceleration brought on by the United States changing course, radically changing course. After 80 years of being on one course, it's now moving into a completely different one. And so we have to come to terms with that, and we have to have a state that can come to terms with that. But there's little sign at the moment, little public sign, that we're doing so. It may be that behind the scenes a lot more is happening, but at the level of public discourse, it's not happening. There's concern, I think, across the community about some of the things, but I don't think there's much discussion or understanding of what it means for what Australia should be doing. So that's the big picture story of what this is about. Would you like me to sort of launch into a bit of that with the Trump?
Yeah, I think we should start at the deep end, really. That's certainly, I think I think the business, your ideas about the need for a stronger Australian state are, I'm interested in those, but I actually don't want. I think I'd rather frame the whole thing in terms of the Trump emergency, if I can use that term. I don't know whether you want to agree with me about that. I think you do. That was what struck me, and we may want to work back to the where you started, because
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's why I wanted you to.
Yeah, it's
Have this
basically a question
conversation.
of layers.
So over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically a question of layers. You have a series of immediate issues that are confronting you,
Yep.
and then you have issues about your ability to respond to those issues.
That's
so
right.
the state issue is really in that second category. Let's stick with the first category.
Yep.
I think the way to understand, and ultimately, you need a much more sophisticated analysis than I can do in a few minutes. But you need to understand, or we will need to understand, that what's happening in the US, and hence what's happening to the world through the US's change, is coming at us like a signal on different wavelengths. Or a little different bandwidths, if you prefer.
Yep.
So we're getting at least 3 different wavelengths of change. And it's important to separate them and to understand them this way, because their implications and the way we deal with them is very much influenced by which wavelength the matter is coming to us. So let me just quickly explain that. The 3 are these. The first one is that there's some fundamental, I'd say, political economy, or at least economic issues that are facing the United States that Americans want to deal with, and which they feel has been weakening America, which is correct, I think, that America has been on an unsustainable economic trajectory, and it wants to make that adjustment. And that's important to identify that, because that's the real politic thing behind what is happening with America today, and it is likely to persist beyond Trump.
Exactly. So, and also, if you are, I always think that people who disagree should be disagreeing in order to improve the position of the person that they disagree with. And it's also kind of reactionary to say, oh, could the United States please go back to being what it was, when it has legitimate reasons for saying we can't keep doing this.
And some of this has not just begun with Trump too. There was actually elements of this already in the previous administration with Biden, and before that Trump won. So it's not a new thing entirely. It's This economic reality is the first thing. Now there's more than just the trade thing in that, but I'll come to that in a moment. The second wavelength that's coming at us is an ideological shift. Now, the ideological shift in the United States is extremely difficult to disentangle, because it's not one. It's not even a coherent one. It's actually a collection of ideological shifts which have occurred in the US population way beyond just Trump, championed by all sorts of voices, some of them heavily invested in by all sorts of interests. And those ideological shifts have not had as much traction in the American system as they've had now with Trump too. Trump too has given them much more traction, but they're contradictory. There's a whole group of them, and they don't necessarily gel. But as often happens when there's a political shift, an alliance is thrown together of different ideological groupings, and that's what's happened. A whole different grouping of ideological trajectories have come together and been loosely formed into an American policy statement. But where that goes, there's already significant battleground fights going on within the movement in America. So that, I think, is somewhat incoherent. But that's the second thing that's happened. And then the third thing, a completely different wavelength again, comes about from the thing that a lot of the media like to pay attention to, at least the media of a certain kind. And that is essentially the psychological and psychosocial and pathological element, the erratic, the incoherent, people often use words like mad, aspect of this particular administration. It must be taken seriously, although it does generate a lot of comedy opportunity.
Yeah.
But it must be taken seriously because it's precisely this type of particularly cult of personality aspect that can be extremely dangerous for everyone, and can persist for quite a while. But I
Well,
think
cult of personality and cult of unreality as well.
yeah, that's right.
Seriously, it's not a joke. I mean,
No.
I don't want to have a very strict, I'm not arguing, for instance, that, you've got science and science always tells you something. It's more complicated than that. But you've got just complete unreality that Volodymyr Zelensky has 4% approval ratings.
Yeah, there's
You sort of,
massive misinformation, propaganda, and
exactly,
everything else.
exactly, and no one retracts anything, and you've got to really be paying attention to keep having those uncomfortable collisions with reality, and that's, I think that's an important thing. Anyway, you go on.
Well, I particularly want to focus on one aspect of that third one, the
Yeah.
third wavelength, and,
Yeah.
and that is the emotional aspect.
Yeah,
It is a deliberate political tactic to create a culture of fear. And that fear and violence base can easily spread into essentially a fascistic or a much worse formulation than
Yeah.
we've definitely got yet. I mean, there's plenty of people worried about it.
fear. Yeah, fear is one thing, and hysteria. Fear and hysteria, they're different things.
Yep.
And hysteria is very important because you can do anything. If you think. You mentioned to me in an earlier conversation we had today this term which stuck in my mind, which is end of days.
Yeah.
And I recall I think he was a junior minister in the Reagan administration being asked in a press conference what his long-term vision for America was over the next 30 to 50 years. And he said, well, he thought God might intervene before that time. And there's a bit of that going on in the United States.
There's a bit of that going on, and it is, as I say, I think there's multiple strands of this one, just as there are of the other two. But the strands that are particularly scary are those types of strands,
and they're not just religious end of days scenarios.
Not just religious.
We've now bred our own very, very secular end of days concepts in our minds.
Well, there's one aspect which I would call political Darwinism. There's a belief that there's a certain sort of political class who are basically validated by their success.
Yes.
And this is sort of power politics, basically.
Yeah. Power worship.
And of course, we've seen it all before.
Yeah.
And this is where I won't, as you ask, go back into my earlier work on this. But the basic issue I've got is that the international order, the political order, the economic order that we've been operating under for decades, hasn't been global. It's always been up against competitors, but it's been an order with its domestically a liberal democratic foundation. This is like Fukuyama's a real understanding of this as an end of history was that this was the most advanced state we could get to for managing this fear and this power dynamic. The way you manage it is to have this sort of pretty idealistic, I suppose, idea that all nations are equal and all people within nations are equal.
Yeah.
At least in terms of the respect they have as individuals and so on. So it's not a power dynamic, it's not a fear-based dynamic, but rather a participatory dynamic. Now that, of course, doesn't serve all interests.
Yeah.
There are interests served by undermining that and replacing it.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on.
You keep going. Sorry.
So they're the three wavelengths of this American communication that we're receiving in 2025, a year that may yet emerge to be like the first year of the 21st century, where a lot of these power instruments which exist in technology and in all sorts of other spheres are brought to bear to address a particular agenda in the 21st century, which is not in Australia's interests. And when I say Australia, I'm really just using us as an illustrative example of the old liberal democratic order, of multiple countries, and the other countries that are perhaps not liberal democratic, but which are nonetheless had joined in that order in material ways because it was in their interests to do so. So I think that's the challenge. Now, the US problem, starting with the economic, though,
Yep.
is probably not going to be addressed very effectively by Trump's strategy or Trump tactics. But it's a real problem
Yeah,
and
sure
will
is.
have to be addressed eventually. And it will have implications for us. America can't go on indefinitely building its public debt
Yeah.
and indefinitely building its national debt with a current account deficit. It can't go on doing that indefinitely without weakening its position in the world. And I think that I'm not sure that tariffs will work particularly well to deal with that, but that nonetheless is real,
Yeah.
has to be addressed, and I think will be addressed. I mean, a lot of it's their own doing with their problem, their imbalance of saving and investment, which they could deal with in multiple ways. Tariffs is only one tactic, but they'll deal with it. And the consequences of them dealing with it are things that we then have to deal with because,
Yeah.
frankly, there is an element of advantage which we've all learned to take from that structure.
Yeah, that's right. Pharmaceutical benefits is in line.
Whatever it is, I won't
Yeah.
perhaps get into the
Well,
micro.
no, I think I'd appreciate if you would you finish your point, but I would appreciate it if you'd go through the things you see as susceptible to the Americans changing.
I will.
Yeah.
I can mention at least a few of them.
Yeah.
I just want to mention a couple of other things, though, that are
Yeah. Good.
intrinsic to all of this in the economic space, right? So
Yep.
these are the things that I think will persist and continue as issues for us. The second one is that America is a rent-seeking oligarchy.
Yes, I like this point you
So
made.
when we deal with America, we shouldn't think. I mean, all of the political scientists will like to talk about it as America and Russia and Britain and Europe and China,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
if these are entities that mean something.
Yeah.
What we're dealing with is a global competition amongst different oligarchies, which are unfortunately becoming the dominant power in
Yeah.
one country after another.
Yeah.
In some cases, they're it. In China, Russia, and Iran, and so on. It's just oligarchic power.
Yeah.
But even in these liberal democratic countries, oligarchies are asserting themselves very strongly.
Yeah.
So American oligarchy is based essentially on rentier capitalism. It's a system which gets a very high rate of return on equity by constraining supply, by exercising monopoly power or oligopoly power and or financial power in the global system. Now, the American system, and this is a really important point, the American system of pursuing this, which underpins extraordinary valuations of leading American tech corporations,
Yep.
is threatened by who? It's threatened by competitive capitalism, never by socialism or communism.
Yes.
It's threatened by competitive capitalism. In other words, the ability to undercut those the market power of those
rents. Yeah. Yeah.
And the country that has the strongest ability to undercut and that has regularly done so in wave after wave
Yeah.
of competitive intervention in the global economy is China.
Yeah.
And not speaking pro-China here. I'm just making the observation that country, but not alone, competitive capitalism does still exist. That is to say, people who go for scale and go for winning on cost and price.
Winning on cost and price and quality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, Twitter is a dominant micro-blogging platform. It's not competing on quality. It's an important point. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, this is not a low cost. This, like 30 years ago, you'd be saying, oh, yeah, that's, textiles, clothing and footwear or something, toys and plastic goods.
Yeah.
But now it's everything, right?
Yeah,
so
that's right. And no, it's not jets, and it will soon be jets. It will
it's
soon
very
be
soon jets.
Exactly.
The Chinese are now launching off into the marketplace with their first jetliners.
That's right.
And you look at areas like the space race or satellites launching or, the whole gamut of things. I mean, even as far as going to the moon. And not just China. I mean, it's not just China. And it's not just this sort of mass production scale thing either. A lot of it is a public policy driven thing with things like infrastructure, the famous Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
and also the evolution of rivals to the American financial system, which is a very early stage
Yeah.
process, but talked about a great deal.
And America's late imperial muscle flexing can only accelerate the arrival of competitors. Because if
It
you
does.
can't make the SWIFT network for financial payments work for you, you've got to find a way. To exchange value without the SWIFT network, and so on it goes.
It does. And not just in substitution, also in creativity. And this has been the really fascinating aspect. It's like a dynamic aspect of competition that goes beyond simply trying to do the traditional economic things of getting scale or of getting, greater efficiency or productivity in the traditional sense, but they're using creativity. And so when America tries to constrain this competition, it immediately not just it fails quite quickly because workarounds are found. People find ways. This is the DeepSeek story, particularly with AI, where they were denied access to chips, and so they got creative and said, "Well, how can we do this without those chips?" This type of question. Now, I'm not going to go into the DeepSeek story in any depth, but it's an illustration of the way this competition operates. The same thing with sanctions, of course. The use of the American dominance of the financial system to impose economic sanctions on people has brought forth innovation of all sorts of kinds, and both at the private level, but also at the public sector level, brought forth this innovation and alternative channels for infrastructure of finance and of trade.
Yep.
Now, I'm not for 1 second saying that this competition will always win or always has won or is always able to undercut America. And I don't even think I want to undercut America in all respects. But when
you want to discipline America. You want to discipline America. Well, you want them to compete, not to oligarch.
You don't. And I think it's almost a mantra in the South, the global South, that they don't want to choose between America and, say, China or anyone else.
Yeah.
They want a world of open exchange and intercourse on global rules, not on rules designed for the benefit of just one or another side. And that's America. I mean, it's behaving like a lot of countries, perhaps in history, have behaved when they were losing their preeminence. They start looking for devices to hold on to their preeminence, which
in fact accelerate their relative non-preeminence, uneminence.
Britain's the obvious prior example, and Britain has taken a long time to reconfigure itself. In fact, I'm not sure they've quite done so. Reconfigure themselves in a community of nations rather than as one of the dominant nations. And they've still got a lot of people, dreaming about their former glory. As a dominant nation. But the reality is their future is in a community of nations, and it's up to them what that community consists of. But they've made some bad calls because of their glorious past, and I think America is making some bad calls as well. But I'm not here to save America. I think America's got a lot of life left in it.
Absolutely.
And I think it's
the Great Republic, a great country. But anyway, go on.
It's got a potential to maintain a significant role in the community of nations. But it's up to them as to how they do that. Our problem at the moment is that America's got these fundamental economic drivers, this oligopolistic bias in their entire system, which completely configures the way they're thinking, and this is now being caught up in this ideological stream, the second stream in my wavelengths, which is distorting their choices. So that, I guess, in a nutshell, is my assessment of the fundamental economic things facing America, and I've said a few basic things about the other strands in that. America's tactics now to deal with its economic problems are quite problematic for all of us, because it's
and for them, but yes, much more so
them,
for
but
us.
now for us.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I say us, I mean, obviously I'm thinking about Australia, but I think it's not radically different for most other countries that have been part of the sort of liberal democratic club for a long time. As a commodity producer, we're best off, and I'm just imagining Australia continuing as a primary commodity producer, we're best off with a world of active competition and trade and international openness, because that maximises growth,
Yeah.
maximises demand. And if you're a natural monopoly type commodity producer, which anyone doing minerals or energy or food is,
A natural monopoly, you're saying?
it's probably not a monopoly, but it's got a natural source of rent.
Exactly. Yeah.
So to be quite selfish as Australians,
Yeah.
in that positioning of our economy,
Yeah.
in other words, we're better off with the Chinese than the American model, because the Chinese model is, and I'm not really putting it up as the Chinese model. It's really I prefer to think of it as the global majority model.
Yeah. Well, I want to draw you out on that at some stage, if this is a good time to segue,
Well, I mean,
as they say in the business.
I think China has been, ironically, it's quite ironic given that it's, a type of oligopoly, oligarchy itself. But
Yeah,
it
well,
is,
or arguably a tyranny, but it's probably better.
I mean, whatever
better to
language
think,
you like. But that's the irony. But the fact is, it's been
its economic strategy is competitive capitalism, not oligarchic capitalism.
rather than
And I was going to actually ask you, Greg. I mean, it seems to me that's kind of, if China's going to succeed from where it has been, that's the model it has to adopt. It's going into markets that it's the newcomer, it's competing, and so it's naturally now a sort of
America, I feel, is gifting them a sort of a
yes.
gifting this to them to some extent by their own strategy.
Yes.
Where they're trying, because of their particular nature of their oligopoly, they're trying to preserve privilege.
Yes.
And China's coming across as, oh no, India, oh no, Africa, oh, we will create conditions in which you can come into the participation as a community.
Yes. So that's right. So the model in your head is that America is hanging on to its rent, and China, everyone wants rent, but China's access to rent is through competing strongly and then running what used to, I don't know whether you're familiar with this term, but it's a Japanese term, which is flying geese, the flying geese model. And so Japan was this country that got into export-led growth, and then behind it, it drew in the Asia Pacific, what we used to call the Asia Pacific tigers, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore were the four early ones, but then more and more parts of Southeast Asia got drawn into this. And you're saying that China is now doing that with India and Africa.
And they just want, that they will achieve dominance through their methods. And I'm not saying that it's wonderful or perfect, but by any means, from a global point of view, but it certainly is a growth model.
Well, I mean, it is, from our point of view, leaving aside the politics of China, from our point of view, it's a benign form of economic activity. I mean, that's kind of obvious because they want a lot of our minerals, but it's...
Well, we've been living off this relationship, and with you've mentioned Japan and Korea and others. We've been living on. This is where we butter our bread. I mean,
that's right. This
is us. But it's not.
This is why it only took from 1945 to 1957 to the scandal of the RSL for Jack McEwen to go and sign an agreement with the Japanese to sell them all this stuff.
And now we might be needing Japanese subs. Who knows? So the thing is that. So I think that's the sort of dynamic of, but for us, it's not that therefore that we're going to sort of ally ourselves in some sort of neo-imperialist Chinese camp. It's that we don't want to get into neo-imperialist camps. We need to say to America, which I think most of our history since the Second World War we have been saying, but perhaps not so much lately. We want to stick with that open model.
But we've been saying it there's been a couple of corners of our mouth, and
Yeah.
certainly, I mean, the thing that I find kind of extraordinary about Australians, and this is kind of all the way down to the pub, not just the politicians, is that I can't count the number of times Australians have said to me, "Well, if we want the Americans to protect us, we should we should do them whatever favors we can." Now, yes, we certainly want to stay on good terms with the Americans. We certainly want to tell them that if there's a decent alliance going, we'd like to be part of it. But it's in the context of us each understanding that we pursue our national interests, and it's in our and it should be according to our understanding that when push comes to shove, America won't be here on the basis of the favors we've done them. Have a look at Canada. It will help out if it's broadly in alignment with their interests. And this seems to me to have dropped out of, I don't know how much it ever was there. I mean, when Bob Menzies stands up in the House of Representatives, and I think it's 1964, and he says this very strangely worded announcement, which of course Izzy Stone would always notice these things. And he said, "I am in receipt of a request from the United States for us to send troops to Vietnam."
Yeah.
They'd asked for the bloody request.
Yeah.
For goodness sake, can we have a mature alliance with the United States based on some kind of understanding of respective self-interest? Anyway,
well, exactly. But I mean, there's a number of layers in that aspect as well. I mean, there's the issue of the nuclear shield and the nuclear balance in the world.
Yeah.
And the nuclear balance in the world has been based on America and others having certain capability and of a kind which basically stopped the nuclear equation being brought into any conflict.
Yep.
And then there was this sort of step down from that, which is that each sovereign nation may need or should seek to make a full contribution to its own defence. And I think that there's a view, well, certainly my view, is that Australia should be able to defend itself at that second level.
Yes.
But, and not only that it needs to be able to defend itself because it simply cannot trust any alternative.
For the same reason that the French nuclear deterrent was built independently of the Americans on the grounds that one day they might not help out. And
Exactly.
the British nuclear deterrent was not built in that way.
Right.
And look where we are now.
Basically fallen apart. But the reality is that if America is saying to the world, as it seems to be now, that there is no nuclear protection.
Yeah, that's right.
I think the world is being driven into nuclear proliferation. And that's a huge strategic change.
Yeah.
But ideally, Australia, I mean, the deal, to use Trump terms, the deal that Australia really needs, and all of us need, all of the other middle powers and smaller powers need, is essentially a deal where they're not threatened by nuclear attack, because we can't defend ourselves from nuclear attack. And if America would come in and provide that, and we say to them, look, we'll provide facilities like Pine Gap and Northwest and so on, or even submarine bases and other things, for that nuclear aspect of things, for that balance, for that capability.
Yep.
Not in order to avoid our obligation to be able to defend ourselves in all other types of dispute. That hypothetically might be, if it was to become the global pattern again, that would be viable. Be
a bit more specific. If what was
America would have to change its current positioning. I mean, its current positioning is basically to ally itself with Russia, which eliminates. And I mean, who knows what's coming? I don't know.
Yeah.
But at the moment, we've all lost faith and trust in America.
But then, if that has been demonstrated, then it doesn't seem to. I can't quite see how you say we aspire to that nuclear umbrella in the future, knowing that it can change, knowing that it.
I agree that it's an incredibly dangerous strategy, but so is the alternative of going nuclear ourselves. But the
Well, let's talk about that. I want to
yeah.
get your thoughts about
Well,
that too.
I'll
But
come
you
back to
finish
it.
your point. You finish your point.
Let me just make this point.
Yeah.
Whereas the economic story, I think, will persist for years and decades. Like
Yes.
this basic
Right.
driving. There's the one part of Karl Marx that I buy, which is that the economics is pretty powerful at the base of all of these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
That
Yeah. Yeah.
part is
Yeah.
for real.
Yeah. Well, there are. I mean, Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter described himself as a Marxist. I mean, the book Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and Schumpeter's a fairly right-wing guy. It's all Marxist. He says, I'm starting with Marx, and I think Marx has got the basic analysis correct, and I'm not taking it in a workers of the world unite direction, basically.
Yeah, but see, Schumpeter was wrong. So,
Okay.
so basically, I mean, Schumpeter was great, but he was look, and Marx was a fantastic analyst of capitalism and
Yeah.
a fantastic analyst of history and
Yeah.
a fantastic theoretician about the structure of history.
Yes.
But where he was no good at all, and where
No good at all.
Schumpeter made the big mistake of
Yeah.
buying into it, was
Well,
the
it was a
belief
mad big asterisk. It'll all be better after the revolution.
that after the revolution, the proletariat would have class consciousness and take
Yeah.
a left-wing perspective and take us
Yeah.
into a
Yeah.
socialist nirvana.
Yeah.
That was wrong.
Yeah.
We've now got an entire century, the whole 20th century,
Yeah.
and beyond now into the 21st, showing that what happens is, in fact, that fascism, not communism, is what actually emerges, or neo-fascism as it now is. And that fundamentally is the lesson. So that, okay, so that's that. But just to get back to my, whereas the economic base of this, I think, is locked in and is going to play out for the long haul, regardless of political flavors in America. This aspect that we're talking about now, about whether America chooses the model of the last 80 years or a new model where it's forming into alliances with people like Russia, that I don't think is locked in yet. I don't think that's locked in. It doesn't have the same lock-in as the economic story.
Yeah.
So this aspect of the political evolution of America remains a swing variable.
As you were talking to me earlier about the degree to which there's been Russian penetration, if you like, Russian influence in the United States right now. Can you make some further comment on that?
Well, look, I am sitting here in Australia, and I'll only say what I can understand from what I can see and what I can hear and so on. So I can't be certain about this. But
sure, of course.
It is extremely hard to explain American choices at the moment without imagining significant Russian interference in American politics. They are overtly pallying up with Russia and singing the misinformation sheet of Russia.
Yeah.
And there is, I put it at the moment in a category of deep concern that Russia has in fact penetrated significantly into the political apparatus of the United States. And I think some of the appointments, some of the tactical positions, certainly the information which is being used in American dot points look awfully like Kremlin dot points, sometimes almost identically. And that is a concern. I can't say that I know that.
Sure.
I can't, I'm in no position to know it. But, if you can read tea leaves at all, and they're not even just tea leaves, it's pretty explicit, people are apparently, and this must have gone on for quite a while. I mean, we now know that people like Steve Bannon have been in active, interchange with key Russian ideological figures for years. And I'm not particularly focusing on him because I'm not sure how influential he is at the moment. But there are many, many others besides him who, at a more perhaps prosaic and operational level, seem to be in that camp. Now, that is one aspect of it. I mean, I think there is a second one, which is that when America talks about Greenland and when America talks about Canada even, which is rather close to home for us because I don't think we're far away from that list, or elsewhere, or doing real estate development or other types of development in carve-ups in Ukraine or Gaza or wherever, you've got a neo-imperialist ethic and a neo-imperialist push in the US at the same time that you've got and have had for years a Russian version of that type of neo-imperialist, taking over, saying that Ukraine isn't a real country, etc. It's basically manipulating whatever they can.
Yeah, Canada's not a real country.
And so then Canada's not a real country. And they're better off with America.
Yeah, well, they don't even have their own king, And that's something they have in common with some others.
So these types of non-sovereign respect type philosophy, they're basically neo-imperialist philosophy. The world lines up. You've got a big power that takes its sphere of influence. You've got another big power that therefore takes its sphere of influence. And this sort of deep philosophy of, or the deep sort of psychology of, political Darwinism, which is, the Europeans are weak, so they've got to suffer, and even statements like, hopefully Russia will take over some of these countries. I mean, literally, these are the types of things that Trump has said on his journey to where he is today. And so this type of carving up is very 19th century, put it that way.
Yeah.
And it's a step back from this, end of history type achievement that we'd made in the 20th century, only after tens of millions of people had died.
Yeah.
We'd reached this idea of a world which was subject to essentially a rules-based order. Now, that walking away from that rules-based order and inserting instead a power-based order, that's the one thing I'm not certain America is locked onto, because I think they've kind of fallen into it by surprise to some extent. I think there's already an opinion shift in America saying, I don't recall signing up for this. You can only wonder what rock they were hiding under. But nonetheless, their people are shocked and surprised in America. And I think it's at least possible that America could turn back from this. If it did, that's when I say we could reconfigure our relationship with America.
Yep.
Reconfigure it with a little bit more realpolitik on our part, a little bit less sycophancy.
Yeah.
But perhaps one where America, not just alone, we'll only know that America's taking this seriously if they then start talking to everybody about this, trying to put the genie back in the bottle on nuclear proliferation.
I've sort of tried to imagine, I've sort of tried to read between the lines of American politics and think, okay, so the next election comes along, let's assume Trump's not standing, let's assume that the Supreme Court is not sort of utterly corrupt and it actually thinks that the Constitution, the term limit of the Constitution stands. And America's taken over the Panama Canal and maybe Greenland, let's say. I mean, maybe it'll take longer, but I can't imagine the Democrats standing on a platform of giving them back, because there is so that you can make this is a thing. But in the short term, the bully does very well, and the public think you get a bit of a rush from it. Sorry, you go on.
No, I agree that it won't look like that. Probably won't. But will America decide to rebuild its relationship with Europe, having taken a bit of Denmark? Will it basically stay with this and continue to intimidate Europe all the way and ally with Russia, etc., or will it try to?
It doesn't make much sense. Yes, it doesn't make much sense. Okay, all right. Well, I think
that's the question.
You've answered my question, which is the way I'm thinking is roughly right, but then there's the question of what comes next. Yeah. And you're saying at that point, this strategy that the Americans are on makes really no sense for them, and I kind of get that. I guess it depends if there is, how deep the hooks are that have been got into.
And look, honestly, these hooks are very deep. Probably the main thing that will bring it unstuck, if it does come unstuck for this regime, will be that in that second wavelength, the ideological war within itself you've got constitutionalists, you've got traditionalist populists,
Yep.
you've got techno-futurists,
Yeah.
you've
Yeah.
got some traditional rentier capitalists who've been running campaigns now for 30 years to undermine the state, science, respect in the world, etc.
Yep.
You've got these people are viciously opposed to each other under the sort of, once they get into a stress condition. At the moment, they're working together. It's an unholy alliance.
Yep.
The only way unholy alliances hold together, and we've had these in history repeatedly for centuries, but the way they hold together, you think of, let's just take Hitler or Stalin or Xi or anyone, they end up holding together because there's a strongman who actually betrays multiple elements within the coalition, and they fall out of windows. They
Yep.
they end up in gulags. They go to their death even, but they certainly lose power. And all of those corporate interests that got behind Hitler were turned into pawns within a few years.
Mm.
And you see how the oligarchs in China get treated when they get a bit uppity.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
quickly get brought back into place.
Yeah.
And I think that's how that system survives. It ends up being, that's why I end up seeing it. Eventually, it regresses
Yeah.
to a type of neo-fascism. For fascism is when you bring everything under one ideological rubric, held together by violence.
Yep. Yep.
That sort of cohesion
Yep.
only comes late in the piece through a process of one line of power becoming dominant. Now, America hasn't got that yet. America isn't yet in
No.
that
Well,
position,
it's a fair way. It's a long way from that.
but it's made its first steps.
Yeah.
And that's the question. So I think there's still room for America to be in a community of nations because there's still room for it not to go down that path. But it's a narrowing probability because the probability is that the economics is going to happen regardless. I mean, it would happen even under a democratic or a progressive regime. But the other aspects, I think, are still to come. And of course, the madness side, well, it pretty much depends at the moment on those people are really not capable. And so I think they will, by and large, fall away unless one of them gets into this neo-fascist standing. But
Yep.
prior to that,
Yep.
they'll fall away out of sheer incompetence.
Okay, I want to take you to two things. I want to revisit the chat we had earlier about nukes. I just want to draw you out a bit more on that, and then I want to return, probably conclude with some of your thoughts about the need for some kind of reconfigured global coalition, which you spoke about privately at the meeting that I went to. On nukes, you said that Australia trying to defend itself with nukes is very dangerous. Now, are you saying that the world in which Australia defends itself with nukes is very dangerous? Because I agree with that. That's a world of nuclear proliferation. In a world of nuclear proliferation,
we will participate in a world of nuclear proliferation.
I would think it's a pretty good way to make it. It's a pretty good capstone on a structure called the Echidna strategy. It's a pretty good way to tell people that if they want to attack us, they'll have hell to pay.
It's going to be expensive. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
I agree.
Okay.
Basically, the danger in it is, of course, that that you get ahead of the pack and you then generate even more proliferation. I mean, I think nuclear proliferation in itself is massively dangerous because I don't think you can ever be sure that a country will be run by whoever it's currently run by.
I totally agree with that.
So, I don't particularly want to name anyone, but, a country that you might trust today could be taken over tomorrow by people you can't trust. But they inherit the capability. We live in a community of nations in our region, which includes the world's fourth biggest population country right next door to us.
Yeah.
And several other very significant countries, none of whom have got nuclear arms.
Yeah.
And the question is whether we really want a world in which,
Well, no, we don't. We don't.
not where Australia has got nuclear arms, but where everyone has got nuclear arms.
Yeah. Look, I'm even conflicted about that, Greg, because of course a world of huge nuclear proliferation sounds terrifying. But then we have, the way we've staved that off is with the sort of alliance arrangements that gave us World War One. So yes, this is a sort of Nassim Taleb argument that yes, we might get a really terrific record of nobody using nuclear weapons until someone does, and then we're 2 hours away from an incredible, with something. It's actually not the extinction of human beings, but by God, it's not too good. And so, if you, so one way to put this, a most horrifying way to put this, is that those people before World War One who used to say we need a war, stiffen up the young folks, that sort of stuff. It's the sentiment isn't that it's not because we need a war to keep us strong. It is that we need a nuclear war to keep nuclear war in people's minds, because I think they slipped away. So my view, right throughout the period of time when we've been getting concerned about climate change, as we should have been getting concerned about climate change is a really important thing. But by God, for me, it just pales into insignificance next to nuclear war. Literally 2 hours away from a massive catastrophe so far beyond our imagination, it's not funny. And so, I guess I think it's just a sort of basic numbers thing that that trying to make sure nuclear war never happens. Of course, at any one time we should be trying to do that, but to build a strategy around never having any nuclear war, we end up where we were, which is World War One set of structures of alliances when eventually something goes wrong, and it might quite easily just be a mistake. It might be a blip on a radar screen, or it could be somebody like Donald Trump and getting himself very excited about something and being he has impulse control problems. We can tell that. Anyway, I'm
with you. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm with you in the sense that I think this is like, it's almost like a game theoretic issue.
Yeah.
But I'm very nervous about the idea that we sort of can teach ourselves lessons with small nuclear wars.
Well, I agree. I don't know about. Yeah, okay.
It's that sort of
but I guess it is to put it in its best rhetorical form. If nuclear war is inevitable in the next 500 years, which I think is a reasonable suggestion, why don't we try and make it a small war rather than a continental exchange?
Yeah.
Anyway, look, we who are we? We're economists. We don't know anything, and the military folks don't know much either.
I think the only nuclear war we've had, the people that used the weapons were successful. They were victorious.
Yes.
The next nuclear war that we have, the people that use the weapons are as likely to be successful and victorious again as not.
Yes.
And in that success will bring its own risk and its own danger. So that's but we're talking about things which to a large extent can't be known.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly.
But what we can know right now is what the current situation is.
Yes, I agree with that too.
Not good. There is this choice, this almost like a switch point.
Yeah.
I'd say it's probably going to be made within the next couple of years, given the way the American system works.
Yeah.
But that switch point at the moment could switch left or right. So I don't know which way it'll switch.
Yep.
Australia needs to strategically be able to go with that.
Yep.
I think that there's beyond that, I don't think Australia will be able to go much longer with its attitude to nuclear issues, but beyond the weapons issue to, the way the world is using nuclear power and the way the world that therefore develops skills and capabilities. Who manages the supply? We've got 40% of the world's uranium. There are all these functions that need to be thought through as well. And unfortunately, Australia is just totally, unable to discuss this in a dispassionate way and to think through its role.
Yeah.
But I would be, if I was running Australia right now, I would be hedging my bets a bit on nuclear capability. And I'm sure we won't be alone in that. I mean, there are several countries now, multiple countries right now in the same boat we're in, actually worse boat than we're in because they're right next to Russia or whatever, who are responding in this way right now as we speak. So I think we have to get on top of that as well. That's just part of the agenda of what get on top of. But I haven't made a decision in my mind yet because I don't think America has as to what
I think that's a good
order
point.
it wants.
Finally, then, just sketch out for us what you think Australia's foreign policy should be, and what this idea you have for some kind of coalition of liberal democracies. I suppose we used to have one, and then one of the big liberal democracies decided had second thoughts.
The reason the world was until recently participating in all. Well, not all, but in a very broad spectrum of countries were participating in a rules-based order was not because it was American-led. It was because it was the global order. And the global order is an order of the majority of nations. Now, it can fracture or it can continue as a majority order. I don't see it as just an order of liberal democracies.
Right.
I think the liberal democracies have a particular ability because in most cases they are the advanced countries as well, technologically or economically, or both. But they are not the majority. I mean, the way the world this century will unfold is that there'll be significant demographic decline in all of what are now the major countries. China potentially by the end of the century could be as low as 500 million people. It certainly will be nothing like the biggest country in the world. Multiple scenarios as to what they will be, but that fundamentally will change. The world will be made up of a large, broader Asian community of nations and a large African community of nations. People don't like me using the word Africa because there's so many different ones there, but I'll just use it as a collective thing. So demographically, but also economically, the world is going to transition through a significant change. And it's going to do that in this very hostile and difficult environment with people coming and going from power positions and so on. If there's going to be a global order at all, I think it has to be a global order of the majority. So, and it can't be, and it hasn't been a global order based entirely on, you're only in it if you're a liberal democracy. That's not been the system. We've tried to bring the global south in. We've tried to have a participation, at least economically, of China. Other parties. And I think that's the order that I'm talking about, a system of majority, not a system of a one or other or multiple superpower sponsors. That's the difference between an imperialist model and a global model. It's not global government, and it's not necessarily run by the same institutions that we've got now. But it will require an infrastructure that's international. And the countries who are best equipped to build that infrastructure or to support it and to articulate it and to demonstrate it are the liberal democracies because they have the resources to do so better than anyone else. At the moment, that function of trying to build something along those lines is falling to BRICS and the Shanghai Dialogue, which is associated with BRICS. And those organisations are very weak and very narrowly based, although they've got some big members and are expanding. But I think that the time has come for us to try to accommodate that change in a majority order.
That grouping. So you're saying that, essentially Europe and the BRICS, Brazil, India, China, and so on.
Now, when we say BRICS,
Russia's in there.
Russia's in BRICS, right? So, But I mean, Russia's not going away. No one wants Russia to go away. No one wants America to go away. What we want them to do is to stay in their box. We need people to think as part of a community of nations, not as this alternative. So we construct something. It won't be a merger of BRICS because at the moment it's not in the interests of nor would it be a merger with America at the moment. The way America's behaving, I'm not sure that we could articulate this with them unless they quickly recover their position.
Well, they're very used to being the linchpin of it all, and
They
that's
won't be able to leave
problematic. That's problematic. Yeah.
And it's probably idealistic because it is very difficult to do this without a leading nation.
Yeah.
But there is no candidate as a leading nation.
Well, there is. You might. I mean, who knows? This is a long way off. But the EU is not a nation. But the EU is a large body that might be capable of coordinating action.
I do actually think you're right there that the Europeans are potentially a template for the type of institutional relationships that are needed. Yeah. They're probably much more than is needed for an international order.
Indeed. They've had rather too much appetite for coordination among themselves in certain respects. Yeah, that's right.
But it's more than but maybe it's something like an OECD BRICS. I mean, it's a sort of a
it's a networking problem.
Yeah, and I haven't got a design. I mean, that's
so let me. But you see, I think so there's another problem, and the problem is that right now the politics of America doing what it's doing is looking dreadfully to me like the 1930s, and that is that. I mean, and I don't want to launch into too much of my own views about democracy, but democracy, as we can see, that we're going to have elections. We've got elections coming in Australia and Canada. Democracy doesn't work by politicians coming out and saying, those tax cuts we'd like to give you, well, they're all off because we're in a sticky situation. I mean, they might start doing that when the bombs start dropping, but before then, that's not the way to win an election. Now, that's a very bad situation. We are in this particular kind of circumstances, we're seeing the democracies at their worst. The second thing, and related to it, is that we're all hanging separately and not together. There's a sort of terror of Australia saying we don't like the idea that we stand with Canada. We fought with Canada just as we fought with the United States, and this is just completely no good. So is there anything you've got to offer about how you've got a kind of a end vision of the system of the majority, if you like, but what can we do? I have a kind of an idea, which is to use this as an opportunity to start breaking out what I call the other way to represent the people, which is by sampling, not by election. You could, for instance, have, and this can be privately done, it doesn't have to have a government behind it, you could have 50 American citizens and 50 Canadian citizens sitting as a deliberative body, a standing group where people rotate in and out of it. We can do the same thing between Australia and America. That is that's a kind of that brings about the prospect of a genuine unity of sentiment, which can't quite be done among politicians whose job it is to try and take advantage of the other one, of their opponents. So anyway, that's just a thought of mine. I'm not trying to. You're most welcome to comment on it, but I want to get what's your plan for this problem?
Well, my plan is that we get through our election, because realistically, I don't see this election or our political process. So the part that I agree with you is that our political process is
won't do it.
22. Like the people are not demanding this. The politicians are not leading them to
not supplying it. That's
right. So there's nothing's happening. But the reality is that probably even before this election is held, but certainly in the period right in front of us, we are going to confront a range of crises, which won't be bombs dropping necessarily.
No.
But they could be things like a change in the international tax order and so on, which could really damage Australia's economy.
Explain what you mean by that. And you're not talking about. You're talking about the next year or the next 4 years? How many?
Potentially very soon. I think the Americans might shift their thinking towards a destination-based corporate income tax, which would be very damaging for Australia, because it would essentially mean that we would hand a large part of our corporate tax base to our customer nations rather than...
And so what would be the mechanics of how they could impose that on us?
Well, that would require an international shift to
Yeah, and
destination-based
that's
taxes,
going to take time, I would have thought, and we're going to resist it.
except that indirect taxes are already destination-based taxes.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the tariff system that
Mm,
Trump's
mm,
doing now is
mm.
essentially a proxy for
Yeah. Yeah.
a destination-based tax, and there's
Yeah.
plenty of
Yeah.
economists who are willing to write articles and papers saying that the people that will pay the tariff are the countries that export, not the countries that import, which is
Yes. 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 Yes.
so you'll always find people willing to do that and say that. And so but that type of system, you imagine Australia giving up on taxing its mining industry and its energy industry.
Well, it's hard for it to do. It's hard to force us to do that because we levy these taxes, and they're going to
We
have
do
to.
levy them, but of
Yeah.
course, in a global change of system,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, okay, but I mean, something like pharmaceutical benefits is a big thing, and that can happen very
yeah,
quickly. The Americans can just say, "You've got a single desk to buy pharmaceuticals, you got one via the government, and we're going to have one single desk
yeah.
to sell them to you."
And they, at the moment, are playing the game of saying, we're going to dictate your domestic policy
Yeah,
over and over again, and we're
yeah,
not going to let you deal with our corporations uh, in a sort of sovereign to corporate
yeah,
relationship. We're going to
yeah,
say our corporates are part of our sovereign relationship. This is why the corporates in America have all hopped into the sovereign US state and are seeing it in as a vehicle for exercising
yeah,
leverage and power against everyone else to
yeah,
achieve their market goal, which is to
yeah,
increase their margins.
yeah,
Basically, it's as raw as that,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
call
Yeah.
that American, entitlement.
And this is why you're talking about an oligarchic rentier
That's why it's
economy.
very important to understand that
Yeah.
that America is an oligarchic society, not a democratic society. Now, I mean,
Well, and it's a rent-seeking
rent-seeking
capitalism.
oligarchy.
It's a rent-seeking capitalism, not a
Yeah.
competitive capitalism.
And so
Um,
that, and they'll use sovereign methods as well as market methods
Of course, yeah,
to
yeah.
achieve
Oh,
that.
they're well practiced at that.
They are.
They're well practiced
They
at
are.
that. That
So we don't have to have a bomb dropping before
yeah,
we start
yeah,
paying prices. If we start paying prices, then our political system then has to cope with that and deal with that, and that's
yeah,
where the political leadership has to then say, well, okay, well, we're on our own. They've picked us off, well done, because we
yeah,
didn't do anything for all these years.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I would be saying, if I was either leader after the election, I would be having a statement of intent to the Australian people about how we are going to navigate the global order that we're now apparently moving into. And obviously, there'd be a lot of uncertainties and a lot of hedging, but there
mm,
would be a, a decision to make our polity
yeah,
part of like we would bring the entire nation together around this theme.
yep,
And having done that, I'd be hopping on planes and saying, now listen, none of this Airbus elbow nonsense. I'm going to have to talk to
yeah,
Canada. I'm
yeah,
going to have to talk to Germany and Britain
yeah,
and Japan.
mm,
We are going to have to do this together.
mm,
And Australia is going to have to formulate how we would like this process to build. And by the way, Indonesia as well and India as well. Like I'm not just other liberal democracies, but this task is a collective task. It starts from a foundation of an Australian task, and it will require to break the catch-22. It will require a leap of political leadership.
yep,
And if someone has been elected as a political leader who doesn't think they're up for that, they should find the person who is and hand over, because it's that serious. They've got to lose their timidity. They've got
all
to
right.
lose their vassalage.
Eh,
And they've got to move beyond whoever's paying them really underneath the scheme of things. And
yep.
I think if we can, it's a leap, but Australia has made leaps like this before.
Well, it has, yeah, yeah,
You talk about the 1930s. We had to make leaps in the 1930s. We had to make leaps in the 1940s. And
yep,
we basically have no option now but to do that. It won't be able to wait for institutional reform in Australia in the first instance, but it might be followed by,
yeah.
that might come subsequently. But
Well,
and as part of it even.
yeah,
But I don't think that we will have a lot of time the way things are going to avoid that type of leadership in the very near term?
Well, I think that I was wondering how we were going to conclude, and I think that's pretty good. That's a pretty good way for me to draw this discussion to a conclusion. And thank you very much. I feel that my mission has been accomplished, which is to allow you to tell us what you think and scare us all a bit or a lot, because it's pretty serious, and we have this habit in this country, but it's more widespread than other. It's not just this country, to kind of enjoy the luck we've had, enjoy the prosperity we have, and that business of eternal vigilance isn't doing to is always something to try and keep going. So thank you very much, and we will see what we will watch an election unfold, and then we'll see if we have people, leaders inside the political class, inside politics, outside politics, or outside that, or from further afield, who can get this going, get the adjustment going, get the uncomfortable collision with reality to come up with a response to that collision. So thank
Couldn't
you
be a
very
better
much.
title for it, Nick. Thanks very much for giving me the hour or so.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Thank you.